All right. In the studio with me today, I have the two Chris's. Chris Motz, who is the executive director of the South Dakota Catholic Conference. I did that without reading it.
Bravo.
And Dr. Chris Burgwald, the director of adult discipleship and evangelization for the diocese. We are going to talk today a little bit, or a lot, about the COVID vaccines that are available. And basically, may I take the vaccine and must I? Which is what Mr. Motz just said to us a few minutes ago. So I'm stealing your phrase. Thanks for being here, you guys. This is a difficult topic, sort of, because there's a lot of difficult words to understand that are involved in all of this deciding things, and a lot of background that's good to know. So, Chris Motz, will you start by just tell us a little bit what vaccines are available right now, if you would?
Yeah, in the middle of December, the state of South Dakota started receiving vaccines from two different companies, Moderna and Pfizer. And there's kind of an orderly process that's been established by public officials. And they're kind of proceeding through these different categories right now. But the two vaccines that are available are produced by both Moderna and Pfizer. There are other vaccines that we're expecting to be available at some point in the weeks or months ahead from a variety of companies, including Johnson & Johnson and a company called AstraZeneca. And it's kind of important to understand that amongst all these different vaccines, this question you alluded to, may I receive it? You know, we'll kind of, I hope, get into this sort of moral analysis of cooperation with a bad act. But these different vaccines have different levels of connection, if you will, to the evil of abortion, which is something the bishops, for those viewers, listeners that were able to read the bishops of South Dakota's joint statement a couple weeks ago, the bishops kind of parse out the moral analysis for some of these different vaccines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And actually, those documents are really helpful. So if you haven't seen them, you can go at sfcatholic.org and see those documents anytime. Okay, so that's a good introduction to what's available. So the first question I'm going to ask you, you might not be able to answer. So do we know, or are these vaccines safe? That's kind of the first question people want to know. Is it safe?
Sure. Well, maybe the first thing to say is that the church's competency is in faith and morals. Faith, who is God? What do we know about him? And morals, how should we live? It doesn't extend into, science, although we certainly, use science to help us understand things. So the church doesn't have a competency to say whether a vaccine is safe or not. That's something to speak about one's doctor with, and to ask scientists who have developed and understand how these vaccines are used. That being said, we can say that the vaccines that are currently available from Moderna and Pfizer have been authorized by the Food and Drug Administration under what's called an emergency use authorization. It is what is essentially an experimental authorization. That's, when I say experimental, that's not to say that they're not safe.
Okay.
But that is to say that they've been authorized for public use under what is essentially a speedier process. Typically, vaccines that have been developed for, rubella or measles or what have you, there's a years-long process that they undergo to evaluate, and for understandable reasons, the process here has been much quicker. So for just to use an example of what this can mean, I'm in the National Guard, as I think I've shared on this program or maybe others before, and we're required to receive certain vaccinations, but they've taken the position that with an emergency use authorization, the legal authority isn't there to require it. It's just a different sort of category that they fall under.
Sure. Okay. You want to say anything about that, Chris? I know you.
I have really nothing to add,
Okay.
but I think it's. I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with Chris's answer. The church's area of expertise is with regard to to Catholic doctrine
Right.
around faith and morals. So there are Catholic scientists who obviously will have scientific expertise to answer that question. And frankly, there's that, but the church proper, and we're both sort of speaking on behalf of the bishops.
Right.
The church proper has no expertise.
Right.
So,
which is why it wasn't really talked about in those documents.
So this is where from the Pope to our bishops to our priests might have personal opinions one way or the other on the question, but they don't have any formal expertise, and therefore no formal. I think the important thing to take away for us as Catholics, there's not an authority that the church leaders have on these matters.
Right. Okay. Good. So let's start with the may I question first. And this is basically is this a morally permissible vaccine to take? Especially if there's nothing else available. But I know there are a couple things available, but how do we judge that? Chris. Either Chris. Which Chris would like to start?
I want to start with why you're even asking the question.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good place to start.
So the reason you're asking the question, a lot of people might, we assume that people would know the reason why. I think it's important to be, the vaccines that are available here right now in South Dakota, in the testing process in particular, cells that derive from fetal tissue from an abortion several decades ago now were used in the testing process. So there is a grave moral evil, the killing of an unborn human being decades ago, which is involved with, in this case, the testing of. So
not in some of the vaccines, but just in the testing of those vaccines.
Correct.
Yep.
So with these two in particular, the Pfizer and the Moderna. So there is some degree of cooperation, if you will, cooperation with evil involved in these vaccines, and therefore Catholics are rightly asking the question that you're posing: may I take this vaccine? Because as it was being produced, abortion was brought into the picture in a sense. Not public policy about abortion today, but an abortion that was committed decades ago. I think in the 60s?
60s, maybe 70s.
I think. Yeah.
Okay. A long time ago, but still. Can we profit, if you will, from a grave moral evil that was committed?
Right. So.
And the answer is yes.
Okay.
If there are no alternatives available.
Okay.
And if we are making our objection known in some way, so it's not as if we just sort of take it and move on, but at the risk of kind of bringing in a negative connotation with protest, but that's essentially, I'm receiving this under protest,
right?
And you have to share that. I wish that I wasn't in this position of having to receive this vaccine. That has this connection to this really grave moral evil. So it could be done in a variety of ways. The church doesn't tell us how that must be done, that objection made. But one example of a way in which to do that could be just a conversation with one's medical provider. It could also be by sending a letter to public officials or even pharmaceutical companies themselves.
Okay.
So there are a couple of reputable Catholic organizations working in the field of bioethics and medicine. Both the Catholic Medical Association and the National Catholic Bioethics Center both have template letters up on their websites that people could go find and see if that's something maybe they're interested in doing. If they are intending to receive one of these two vaccines, Moderna or Pfizer, how do I use my voice here?
Right.
Those template letters are available.
In a democratic republic that we have, that's the way we get things changed is by speaking up about the things we don't want to see happening anymore. So if we continue to just take the vaccine and walk away, never say a thing, well, they're going to keep using these cell lines. So it'd be good to object and in the best way you can.
I think it's important though to talk about why it's okay at all. Sure. Because again, so this is where that language of cooperation, right, the moral principle, cooperation. So let's take it out of the realm of medicine and abortion completely. If I rob a bank, that's bad.
Right.
If I'm driving the getaway car, I'm cooperating, like knowingly, like my buddy Chris Motz has decided to rob a bank. So I'm like, yeah, I'll be the good guy. I'm cooperating with him in an immoral way in his act. If I just sold the ski mask to Chris that he used in the execution of his nefarious plan to steal money from the bank, I'm involved, but I'm not morally compromised. I'm not morally culpable because my involvement was, in a sense, so removed, if you will. I didn't even know, or even if I came to find out, my selling him the ski mask, or even if I gave him a ski mask, that was not sort of like intrinsically attached, if you will, to his the evil act that he committed.
So they're kind of steps in like how close you are to the actual committing of a crime or an evil.
Right. Yeah, and there is some kind of technical theological language that the bishops use in their joint statement. Is it formal cooperation or is it material? Is it remote or is it proximate? And hopefully the terms are explained somewhat, but it can get, frankly, a little bit nuanced. So it is important to actually try and have a sense of, okay, how close are we to this actual act, but also how serious is the underlying evil? And in this case, we're talking about an underlying evil that is the intentional destruction of human life,
right?
Of an innocent human life, which is a very, very grave thing, which is why we're doing this analysis in the first place.
Right. And the bishops, so our bishops here in South Dakota, including our own bishop, Don Lagarud, the Vatican, the USCCB, they've all said that it is, like, the cooperation is such that it's licit, it's okay, morally okay for us to take the vaccine. I think it's good to point out, because the two questions that we're going to answer, there's another sort of in between. Is it okay? Well, I think I'm actually going to save that comment for the second question as a subset of it. Okay, I'll just anticipate a little bit. Do I have to or not is what we're going to get into, right? Because there's some Catholics who say, what if I want to sort of stand up and say enough is, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Chris, about we should voice our concerns or objections. And there's some Catholics who would say, I recognize that maybe it's morally permissible, it's licit to take the vaccine, but sort of enough is enough. And because I want to protest, if you will, loudly, I cannot in good conscience. I recognize it's morally illicit for me to take the vaccine, but we need to stop using cells derived from this horrible evil.
Because ultimately, the way I would understand this, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but as a Catholic, you understand what the church teaches, and then you have to use your conscience, formed through the teachings, to decide what you're going to do. And you're okay to say, well, I really don't want to do this because of the connection to abortion. So
right.
in the fewest words I can possibly say, that we're okay to do that. We can form our own conscience on that based on what the church is teaching.
That's right. But also understanding that decision, and kind of, again, anticipating where we're going next, which is, do I have to do this? The decision of whether to vaccinate or not is not a morally neutral. There's moral responsibility that's involved in that decision. Yeah. We do have a moral responsibility to the common good. So we should take into consideration a whole host of factors, including what is the risk of serious harm to my neighbor.
Right.
To put it in short terms, what does this mean for my grandparents or my parents? What does this mean for those in the community whom I may be in contact with?
Right. Right. And it will depend too on maybe what you do, how much you're out and about, how at risk the people around you are. I mean, there's a lot of factors that are going to weigh in on that.
So may I? Yes. So now we're talking about must I?
Must I?
Do I have to take the vaccine?
And the answer is not necessarily.
Okay.
It's not a moral obligation, and that's something the The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, so the chief sort of doctrinal body at the Vatican, released a statement not long ago. And I should add, too, that the Vatican has been offering guidance on vaccines for a long, long time.
Right.
This is not a new question that's arisen in the context of COVID. It's been presented to them, and they've responded before. In the most recent intervention that this doctrinal body has offered at the Vatican, they've said that practical reason makes evident that it's not a moral obligation. It must be voluntary. When they use the words practical reason, what they're talking about is common sense.
Right.
So there are lots of things that might be part of the common good. So, for example, we know that serving the poor is for the common good, right? Do I have an obligation to, serve at the banquet, for example? Well, there are a lot of things that go into that decision. Me serving at the banquet, although it could be part of my contribution to the common good, is not in and of itself like a moral obligation.
Right.
Yet at the same time, I do have an obligation to the common good itself. How that gets worked out is something that I need to discern.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, there are certain principles that we do good and avoid evil, like is the fundamental one. Yes. But what does that look like in this particular instance? There's all sorts of factors that I have to weigh with the guidance from due authority. In this case, moral questions from our leaders in the church.
Right. So is the diocese, either diocese in South Dakota, neither is requiring like school teachers in the Catholic school system and so on to get the vaccination. Is that right?
That's correct. And just as a matter of state law, also the state of South Dakota has a number of vaccinations that it requires of students and teachers in schools, and it has announced that it is not adding the COVID vaccine to its list of required vaccinations. But even prior to that announcement, the bishops in an FAQ that accompanied their joint statement, they made clear that at this point in time they're not requiring as a condition of employment for teachers or parish employees or for students in Catholic schools.
Right.
It's not per se required.
Right. And the way I understand it, I think from the information that it hasn't been tested on children yet.
That's correct. That's another thing to be clear is under the emergency use authorization, up to this point, it was only tested on adults.
Right.
And in fact, for the women that were participating in the study to this point, I think just to eliminate certain variables, researchers were testing on women that were not pregnant or with an expectation of becoming pregnant. So they're trying to just sort of narrow their focus group, if you will, from the start. And the testing will be expanded to include other groups, including children. But under the emergency use, it hasn't been tested today.
And thankfully, it's not a virus that is very deadly for children. So that helps a lot. We don't have to worry about get that vaccine right now. So, and they're moving toward, well, at least to begin with, they're vaccinating those who are at highest risk. We don't have any idea yet when it's going to move to the rest of us, correct?
Oh,
or do we?
The expectation is that late spring to early summer, it's going to be sort of available to anybody and everybody that is interested.
Okay.
Right now, and we don't need to get into all the details, but they've got this multi-phase distribution plan, and currently they're in phase 1D.
Okay.
So they're kind of working their way through some of the highest risk categories of people, including elderly folks that live in long-term care facilities, healthcare providers, first responders. It would include hospital chaplains, so on and so forth.
Right.
But the expectation is in the months ahead, it will be available to the general public.
Right. Okay, so we have about a minute or so. We'll just steal from Burgwald's time. But I just wanted to give you guys a chance if there's something we missed that you think that people need to know about. May I or must I?
Well, I think it's just good to kind of recap with using those two questions. May I, yes. Must I, no.
Yeah, good recap. That was easy. All right, good. Well, thanks for going through some of that with us. I know that some of that's been talked about already, but this is going to take some time to get to the point where more people can even get the vaccine. So I want to make sure that people are kind of getting this information as we go.
Yeah.
So it's good to have you guys on. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Next week, we will have on the show Dawn Wolf, who is the Director of Information Technology for the diocese. We're going to talk about how technology and social media can be maybe detrimental to your faith and maybe how to handle those a little better. That is it for us today. Hope you'll join us again next week for more Catholic Views.